Hi everyone, and welcome to the fourth How to Put a Robot in Your Films Using Blender video. Today we're going to be focusing on lighting and rendering, and then tomorrow we're going to be putting everything together that we've made in the first 4 videos. So, the first thing we want to do is load in our background footage. To do this, press N to bring up this side menu on the viewer, scroll down to where it says background image, tick the box and then twirl the menu open, and then click open and navigate to your footage. By default it will show in all of the orthographic views, for example front on, side, top down, as well as the camera. You can change that by just changing this box to camera so you won't see it in all of the views, and it will just be in the background when you look through your camera by pressing 0 on the number pad. First of all we want to add a plane which is going to act as the floor in our scene. This will be what we render the shadows from when they're cast from the lighting in our scene. So make sure it's nice and big and make sure it's perfectly aligned in the centre of your scene on the floor. Next, if you don't already have a camera in your scene, then add one. Press 0 on the number pad to go into the camera's view, and then press Shift F which allows you to control the camera. You can use the mouse to look around, and then W, A, S and D to actually move in the physical space, and you can press Q and E to ascend and descend. Now press Z to go into wireframe mode, and what you want to do is align the edges of your plane to match the perspective in the scene. So for example here, I'm trying to align the edge of my plane with the wall and that cabinet at the back. I just realised it wasn't very clear how I did this. What I did was I pressed Shift F to move the camera around and aligned it doing that. It takes a bit of work, but just make sure you take your time and get it lined up nicely because the perspective is really important. At this point, if you don't like the size or the position of your character, you can go into object mode and change the position and scale of the armature. And by changing this, it will update the position and scale of the model as well. Make sure you're in object mode so that you're not accidentally adding any keyframes or anything by mistake, because that will ruin your animation. Now we need to match the lighting on the 3D model to the lighting in our background footage. Until now, when we're looking at the render in rendered view by pressing Shift Z, we've just been using the HDRI that I imported from the internet. This is good for just checking your materials and make sure everything's working, but for your final render you want to add some proper lights that are simulating the actual footage. The first thing I did is use Google's Street View app to take a 360 photo in the room that I filmed my background footage in. Then I just shared it with myself on my Google Drive and downloaded it onto my computer. Then you can bring it into Blender and use it as a 360 photo to light your scene. So then you'll have all the realistic lighting and reflections from the actual space that you took the footage in. To do this, go into the World tab and set your 360 photo as an environment texture. If you're not sure how to do this, I did it in part 2 of this series on texturing. Although we're using it as a background, the 360 photo isn't currently aligned properly, so go into the node editor and select the World tab instead of the Materials tab. Then we can add a mapping node and a texture coordinates node, which will allow us to rotate our 360 photo and align it properly with our scene. Plug the mapping node into the vector input on the back of your environment texture, and then plug the texture coordinates node into the input of the mapping node. Make sure you connect generated to vector. If you use some of the other ones, it's probably going to distort your 360 photo and look a bit odd. I just changed the Z rotation until the background of my 360 photo roughly matched the background of my footage. Then I also played slightly with the location to change the height. The 360 photo on its own should really be enough to give you the correct lighting for your scene. But if you decide you want to add some extra lighting to get some extra detail, you can do that as well. I decided I wanted to simulate some more light coming from the windows to give the robot a slight edge light. So I did this really simply just by making a plane and scaling it to be about the size of one window. Then I just used a couple of array modifiers to extend it sideways and upwards so that I had the whole lot of windows. Then I just roughly positioned them where they should have been and then duplicated it for the other sets of windows. The last thing I did is just add a sun lamp. I made it quite strong but quite soft because it was an overcast day, and I set the colour to be slightly orange just to give it that sunshine look. And that's all I did for the lighting. It's really simple. Now we have to set things up for rendering. Under the render tab, the first thing you want to do is check your resolution and frame rate to make sure they match your background footage. Then you want to define your output. This should just be a folder you want to save your render to. Then under the file format list, you want to select Open EXR Multilayer. This is really important as it saves all of our render layers into a single file. I'll explain this more tomorrow in the compositing tutorial. Make sure you have RGBA selected instead of RGB or black and white. I think that's selected by default, but just make sure because the extra A stands for alpha, which is your transparency. And we want to put this on top of something else, so everything except for the robot needs to be transparent. Set how many samples you want to use for the render. This will depend on a couple of things, whether you want to go for really high quality or whether you want a fast render. I wouldn't go much lower than 64 because otherwise this will look really grainy. I render most of my animations at 128, and to be honest you don't need to go much higher than that unless it's for something really important. Turn on motion blur just for that extra bit of realism. I find the default of 0.5 is a bit too much, so I turned mine down to 0.34. And then to get the transparent background, come under film and just tick transparent. Then last we have to set up all of our render layers for the OpenEXR multilayer. To do this, come under the Render Layers tab, and you want to select the following. Make sure you definitely have Combined, Diffuse Direct, and Glossy Direct, and also Emission. They're the only ones I actually used in this tutorial, but if you want to get really advanced, you can enable some more of them, and I'll talk about how to use them tomorrow. With all that done, just hit Animation, which will begin to render the sequence. Once your render of the robot is finished, we need to set up the render for the shadow, which is something I recommend doing separately. We need to put the plane onto a second layer, so with it selected, press M and then press 2. You can switch between them by clicking these boxes down here, or just by using the numbers 1 and 2. you just want to make sure that you have the robot on the first layer and the plane on the second layer. Back under the render layers tab, make sure you copy these settings exactly. Enable layers 1 and 2 under scene, and then also layer 1 and 2 under layers, and then under mask layer, set it to layer 1. This is the layer our robot's in, and it means it's going to mask out our shadow. So if you render it now, essentially what you get is the shadow with the robot's foot cut out of it. This is what the mask layer does. This doesn't work until you make the plane a shadow catcher. To do this, go under the Object Settings tab, come down to Cycle Settings at the bottom, and click the box Shadow Catcher. If you render it with this off, it just appears as a flat plane, but if you turn it on, then it only renders the shadows on that plane. All you have to do now is set a new output for the shadow render, and we're good to go. Bear in mind that the OpenEXR multilayer is an image, and it will render as an image sequence, which means you'll have a photo for every single frame. So for example, my animation was about 200 frames long, so I'll end up with 200 photos. Because of that, you'll probably want to create a new folder when you're rendering and then render everything into that. If you render it somewhere like your desktop, you'll just end up with a couple of hundred photos covering your desktop. That's all for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to come back tomorrow for the final video, which is going to focus on compositing all of the stuff we've rendered together.